And welcome, everyone. And a warm welcome also to all of you who will watch this recording at a later stage. The 101 series is very much meant to be revisited and to serve as an introduction to corruption measurement. For example, when there are new colleagues joining your teams, so feel free to send along the link to the recording on our webpage once it is up. Today, we'll be hearing from Stephanie Trepnell, who many of you know for her long-standing and I should say excellent, truly excellent work on issues of transparency and anti-corruption, but also democratization and development. These issues are likewise core to what we do at the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, always with a focus on figuring out how the private sector can help and how we might help empower the private sector in countries around the world to indeed help strengthen the economic and political foundations that underpin democracy. Once again, then, on behalf of CIPE and the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, welcome to the second installment of our 101 series. Before I introduce Steph a bit more in just a few minutes and give her the floor, let me just quickly recap why we are hosting this series and what the second session today will be about. This Corruption Measurement 101 series is designed for practitioners and anti-corruption experts who want a refresher about the basic logic and the foundational questions that underpin measurement. It is meant to orient us where we stand in the space right now, what we know, and what we think will happen over the next few years. We've structured these sessions, starting last week with Paul Haywood, around three questions. First, and that was the first session, why? Why does measurement matter, and how can we go about getting it right? This was last week with Paul. Today, second session, how? What are the options that we have? What are the choices we can make to use existing measures? And Steph will provide us with guidance on these questions in her presentation in a few minutes. And third, coming up next week, what is next in the space of corruption and anti-corruption measurement? And Liz David Barrett will share her thinking and insights with us about this next week. In our first session last week, Paul walked us through the reasons for why measurement matters and how to go about it in a smart and perhaps clever way. Paul talked to us about why it is so tricky to use global indices, the worldwide governance indicators, or the corruption perceptions index, despite the fact that so many governments, but also the private sector and civil society organizations regularly reference these indices. Paul stated clearly that these indices have had a huge impact to put corruption on the agenda. At the same time, he advised caution because anti-corruption experts and practitioners often conflate how to best use these data sources. They, and perhaps all of us, all of us, want to have it all in one index, but that is hard to achieve. On the one hand, we want to use data to understand the logic of corruption, but at the same time raise awareness and advocate for the things that we believe to be important, irrespective of what the data says. We want to track and measure corruption over time and over space, ideally in comparable ways, but we rely on perceptions and methodologies that frequently change. And we want to tackle all sorts of corruption issues that the indices do not necessarily measure in a number of very different sectors, which the indices not necessarily cover. And lastly, we want to get actionable guidance that is applicable at the international level, the national level, the subnational level, and even at firm and company level. But that's not what these indices can do, at least not all at once. So Paul concluded that these indices and the measures are not set up to do all of this for all of us at the same time. And that is a fair and important conclusion. He also laid out how to go about using measurement in a smarter way. And this included accepting what these indices can do for us and what they can't do, being clear about why we want to measure in the first place, and specifying what we want to get out of the measurement piece, at what level, in which sector, and on what issue of corruption. Today, Steph will continue that conversation and elaborate on the how. How can we do that? And how can we do what Paul concluded we should be paying attention to? Steph will be talking about approaches we can take and the effects these choices have, and she will conclude with some guidance about the trade-offs we must accept perhaps when choosing the most useful measurement approach. Now, before I hand it over to Steph, I will say just a few words about the structure of our session today. Steph will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have another 45 minutes for open discussion, questions, and thoughts, just as we did last time. I'll moderate the discussion, but feel free to put in your thoughts in the chat box during the presentation. And if there are thoughts or things that you would like to share in the discussion section in the later half, then please feel free to come in and speak. And now, last but not least, my pleasure to introduce Steph. Stephanie is a global sociologist. She has worked extensively for the past 20 years on conducting and distilling research on a whole range of different issues into policy insights, oftentimes or always perhaps focused on effective and equitable systems. And as you can infer from her being on stage today, she is one of the world's foremost experts in methodology. She applies her expertise on quantitative and qualitative approaches for a variety of measurement purposes and projects, and she advises both international organizations as well as non-governmental organizations. She has worked with the private sector, with NGOs and multilateral development banks, as an affiliate faculty at George Mason University, where she also obtained her PhD. Thank you, Steph, for taking the time today and for preparing this, for sharing your thoughts with us and the guidance. Very excited about your presentation and how it builds on the presentation by Paul last week. And I think that's it from my end. There's nothing else to say. Over to you, Steph.
Great. Thank you, Johannes, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this, these sessions. It's really exciting. I'm just going to share my screen. Always fun with technology. Let's make it big. Does that look okay? Everybody can see that? Excellent. Okay. So thanks everybody for joining us. This is going to be really interesting for me to see what your reactions are. It's sort of a bringing together a lot of different information about how corruption measurement works and what may not work so well. So last week, Paul Haywood talked about the importance of solid conceptual basis for measuring corruption. And this week, we're going to talk about the practicalities of that usage. Is my screen fuzzy? Do I need to fix it? No?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you, because sometimes it goes fuzzy. Feel free to let me know. Okay, so what are the starting points that I think maybe some of you are here, why you're here? So I have this problem and I think corruption data will help me address it. That's great. And a lot of people have said, I found this great new data set on corruption and I want to use it. That's exciting. The enthusiasm is great. They also say, I think corruption data will add credibility to my work. And that is true, but there are caveats. And then there are people who they've been told they need to use it or they need to produce it and they don't know where to start. So this, I would say, is a good starting point for those kinds of questions. So what I'll talk about today are these 5 big questions I think are important for understanding corruption measurement. So what is actually being measured? What is being collected and analyzed? What are the challenges that impact the usefulness of the data? How is data used and abused? And this is often not talked about when we deal with issues of measurement. And number 5, I think this is the big one. How do I apply all this to my context, problem, or goal? And then I'll have some concluding thoughts for you. So what is being measured? Part 1, there are 3 parts to this. So concepts, what are these big concepts? Corruption measurement generally deals with these three big concepts of corruption, anti-corruption, and risk. So what is corruption? Generally, a very common definition of corruption itself is abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And that can include any of these different types of corruption that I put on the screen. There are more, I'm sure, that I have missed. The great thing about the field of corruption and corruption measurement in general is that the borders are porous. So there's always a lot of discussion and a lot of debate and a lot of new ideas coming in. So this is not the entirety of what corruption could be defined as. And then we have something called anti-corruption sometimes. And it generally is about transparency, accountability, integrity, these things that we think prevent corruption from happening. It can also involve responsiveness and ethics. It's a lot about compliance, especially in the private sector. It might even encompass institutional performance and effectiveness, because the idea is if you're performing well, you will be preventing corruption. And that's where that comes from. And then we have this idea about risk that has come to the fore in probably the last 5 or 10 years. And it's about the risk of corruption or the risk of bribery. Basically, it's the risk of institutional failure to prevent corruption. And it's been used very effectively in the procurement area. And we can talk about that a little bit later. And then There could be something else entirely. The great thing about this field is that people are constantly coming up with new ideas and innovating. And in 1 year, in 5 years, there could be something else entirely that would be put up on this slide that is being measured in the field of corruption measurement, which is a really good reason for understanding the basics of how to understand measurement. So part two of what is being measured, the unit of analysis. The unit of analysis is often what the producers of the data are focused on, but that doesn't mean that it's the only unit that they're collecting data on. So these are the 6 big areas, and in the middle you see countries, and that is usually the focus of most corruption measurement initiatives. Like we have a country score, and we compare countries, and that's what everybody gets really excited about. But you can also aggregate country scores into regions and country groups like the OECD, ASEAN, African Union, or low income versus high income, and that becomes the unit of analysis. But really, very often, it's about the country score. But what goes into that country score? What is driving the country scores? It's the information that is collected underneath, like within the country setting. So a lot of times they'll focus on different sectors, sort of like health or education or institutions. They look at policing and security and defense. They can also look to the private sector and collect information on firms and organizations. This can include civil society. This can include NGOs. The group's network box here is very important when you're looking at things like organized crime or money laundering or smuggling, because they operate in these formal and informal groups. A lot of network analysis is happening within that space. So groups and networks has come to the fore in the last 5 or 10 years as being a really important unit of analysis for corruption measurement. And then we have the individual level. While most individual level data is not released because for confidentiality, privacy concerns, it is aggregated into an understanding of how communities are responding or how corruption is operating within communities, within regions, within subnational regions of a country. So this is something you need to be aware of when you're looking at the data, because when data producers might say, we've measured corruption in country A, you really need to ask, well, what did you measure about corruption? Is it corruption, anti-corruption risk that you're measuring? And in addition to that, what sectors are you focusing on? Are you focusing on the public or the private sector? Are you focusing on communities, individuals, citizens, that sort of thing? These are questions that you should ask. And part 3 of what is being measured is laws versus implementation. And this has been an issue from the very beginning, especially when in the 1990s and the early 2000s, corruption measurement was blooming. A lot of people were not clear about the fact that they were measuring laws, and that is not actually a measure of what's happening in practice. So we have 2 sort of giant big areas here. We have de jure, which is the existence or the quality of the laws, regulations, policies, codes of conduct, and these things govern the area of concern. It's important to have that structure, that framework. It is not the same thing as what happens in practice, which is the de facto, and that is usually broken up into 2 general areas. Whether these de jure provisions are implemented and whether they have an impact once they are implemented. And you'll see I've put up on the screen just a general graph that is the strength of the legal framework on the bottom in blue, that's the de jure, and on the top is the effectiveness of the implementation, which is the de facto. And this could be reflective of anything that you're looking at with corruption measurement. And this in particular is about access to information in the defense sector. So you see on the left, you could have a great legal framework, score a perfect score, and not even implement it and get a 0. Or a lot of countries just fall right in the middle. And in the middle of the graph, you have the middling. This is what happens with a lot of corruption measurement. You have a big middle where people sort of do, or countries sort of do okay. And it's not really that illuminating, and you really need to dig. And then on the right side of the screen, you have countries with a really bad legal framework who actually score better on their implementation. What is happening there? This graph is telling us a really interesting stories, but what it's not telling us is what's driving these scores. And that is a lot about the causal mechanism, and we're going to talk about that later. But one thing you really need to understand about corruption measurement is the scores are not going to tell you the whole story. You need to dig to really understand what is happening. So what information is actually being collected? You can categorize data types any way you like, but this is the way that I have done it for the last 20 years, and it's just been really helpful at the outset when I look at a data set to understand what is actually being collected, and then more complex questions can come later. But generally speaking, you have these three big types. You have perceptions, experiences, attitudes, opinions. They're more subjective. You have expert assessment, which is actually a little bit more complex than you think. It's not just an expert sitting in their office in the headquarters saying, yes, I think that's correct, or no, that's not correct. It's a little bit more than that nowadays. And then you have administrative data, which is a word that means recorded data, more objective data, facts, statistics, things that are collected by governments and private sector about their own work. And this is a diagram that I came up with almost 10 years ago now in the User's Guide to Measuring Corruption and Anti-Corruption, which is a really good basic sort of entry into the field of corruption measurement. The field actually has grown substantially in the last 10 years, and so it's not going to give you the whole story now, but it might be a good starting point. So I put them in boxes, and at the time, 10 years ago, this was sort of the universe of corruption measurement. It has exploded since then, and I couldn't even begin to update it because there's just so many, some of which I just hear about recently. But you'll see at the bottom the worldwide governance indicators, which Paul talked about last week. You'll see that they pull from all the different baskets, all the different types of data, and they aggregate all of it into one score. That's a lot of stuff to aggregate, and we're going to talk about what aggregation does, but it is very different from crime victimization surveys that just talk about the experiences of corruption, and they have their pros and cons, all of them, but you'll notice that there are a lot of indices that pull from all the different data types. If you're interested in an additional framing, a more updated framing of data types or data sources, you should look at Mihaly Fazekis and his colleague who just wrote a paper last year on the future of corruption measurement and what they think are the important areas to look at. So what is expert assessment? It used to be just somebody circling boxes and sending in their ideas to headquarters, but we're a lot more educated on what expert assessment can be. And there are three big areas of what expert assessment is. And it's important to know because it gives you an idea of how reliable the data is. So you can have expert assessment that is about opinions, and they get a survey, they get a questionnaire that says, what do you think the problem is? On a scale of 1 to 0, 1 to 5, how corrupt is the police force? This sort of thing. And then you have sort of the bucket of, or the basket of educated guess, based on your own experience, based on your own knowledge. How often does this happen? And if this were the case, what would happen? It could be open-ended, it could be multiple choice, but it is definitely based on their own experience. And then you have something that's come to the fore lately in the last 10 years is about evidence gathering and evidence-based expert assessment. So how much of the budget is published? Do politicians disclose their conflicts of interest? And you have to produce the evidence to back up your score. This is a lot more time intensive, a lot more labor intensive than just providing your opinion. It might even capture the causal mechanism that's driving the score, which is why it's so important, but it is very, very labor and time intensive. So it's not done that often. And very often, these kind of assessments are rated sometimes by the experts that are doing the evidence or providing their answers, or sometimes by a research team in the company or the organization that's producing the data. They're aggregated and they produce a score that provides a broad view of one issue. And that is sort of a very general introduction to what is expert assessment. So what are the challenges with these individual data types? Well, as Paul talked about last week, opinions are pretty insensitive to change, and they're not a great proxy for reality. Think about the recent election. If you have your opinion, you keep your opinion, and it doesn't really change despite what kind of information you're given to change it. So opinions are great for sort of capturing a snapshot, but they're not great for really digging into what is actually happening underneath things. Experiences have their own reporting biases. You would think people would be like, yes, I was asked for a bribe, or yes, I had to give this much money, but sometimes they over-report, sometimes they under-report, Sometimes they feel obliged to answer in a certain way. Sometimes they don't want to answer because it's going to look badly on them when they're asked if they had to give a bribe. So you're not actually capturing the real truth of what is happening on the ground, even though it is much closer and much more fact-based than opinions are, or much more objective than opinions. Then you have something, it's a basket call. I call it administrative data. It's often difficult to obtain for confidentiality reasons. Governments and private sector don't want to give up their data about what their employees are doing, even though it's recorded somewhere. And also they're subject to weak records management in situations and contexts that are low resource, low funding, or they just conflict situations. They just don't record the data. They don't have the means to do it. So even if they should be recording it and they say that they're recording it, they might not. So it's often hard to get a hold of that administrative data. Then there's something I call factual information. It's often information that's not recorded and it's captured in case studies. But case studies are really quite intensive. They're limited in scope and sometimes they're difficult to replicate, even though they bring up really incredible, meaningful findings for the case that they're studying. They're often not generalizable and not replicable. And lastly, you have something I call constructed data. It might be sophisticated, they might be very sophisticated, statistically rigorous composite indicators that aggregate a ton of different sources, sort of like the worldwide governance indicators. But it's not clear what is being measured because there's so many data points that are involved. And also all those data points mean it's quite difficult to capture change because some of them are moving up, some of them are moving down, some of them are not moving at all. How do you know what is actually changing? And maybe they cancel each other out. And then we can move on to challenges that apply to all the data types in all measurements. So the 5 big boxes, this is not the universe of challenges, but these are the big ones. So A, not measuring what you are purporting to measure. This is something called validity. You don't have to remember the words, but they're helpful for capturing the concepts. So this doesn't mean that people are lying about what they are measuring. It just means that they are not able to properly or very clearly or accurately define what it is they're measuring because it is a very messy area. So if they're saying that they've measured corruption in construction in country A, and you dig, what you find out is that they've measured corruption in one region because that's the region they could get access to, and in one subdepartment of corruption because one subdivision of construction because that's what they could get access to. It is a measure of corruption in construction, but it is a very small measure of corruption in construction. It's not the entire country. So just be careful about what people are actually measuring. And for this, you have to dig. And this is going to be the sort of theme for this whole presentation. You have to dig. You have to find out what they are doing because what they are advertising is not necessarily what you will understand that they are doing. So B, measurements are too subjective or they're inconsistent. This is important for expert assessment in particular, but opinions are always going to be subjective. But if you have an expert assessment that has no peer review, then how do you know that the one expert that they chose actually gives the answer that's representative for the country as a whole? So you either have to have good peer review mechanisms or you have to have good statistical approaches to sort of mediating those problems. And margins of error are a big, important part of statistical approaches to measurement, especially composite indicators. And the worldwide governance indicators that everybody knows pioneered this sort of approach to corruption measurement of margins of error are really important. You have to report your margins of error so that people can see whether they can compare. Margins of error have always existed, but they were the first to sort of push as an integral part of understanding. So that's about how reliable the data is across sort of reviewers. And C, data only pertains to a small group or under specific conditions. This means you can't generalize it to other areas. It doesn't mean it's not meaningful. It just means that maybe you can't apply it to your particular context. And for that, you need to go into the methodology paper and understand what it is that they did and how they got their information. Case studies are really helpful for understanding concepts and moving the discussion forward. What they don't do is allow you to compare across 700 different contexts or 190 countries. Box D. The measurement is too costly in time or resources to perform again, and you'd be surprised how much of an issue this is for large-scale measurement initiatives. And this is about the sustainability of the measurement enterprise. It may be an amazing measurement of corruption or anti-corruption or integrity, but it costs so much money and it involves so many resources that they're not going to be doing it again. So dig into the methodology paper and find out what their plans are for doing this again and how it's going to be funded. You're not always going to know, but it is important if you want time series data. If you want to know how things change over time, you have to have both a baseline and the next iteration of data. And it's unfortunate, but sometimes there is no next iteration of data. So all you get is a snapshot. And box E, the measurements don't capture change. This is a thing. You just have to sort of understand that with all kinds of measurement, this is an issue, and it does matter for corruption as well. So if you have very aggregated indicators that pull from a lot of different data sources, they may not be able to capture change, and they admit this. Indices creators all admit that they may not be able to capture change. They may have a conceptual mismatch. What they think they're measuring is not what they're actually measuring, or what they thought would change is not what actually changed, or they might just have some bad luck and not capture the change that they want to capture. So these are the 5 big areas that apply to all data types. And it's good to sort of understand these concepts when you're looking at data sets, because they will help you understand if it's the kind of data that you want to use. So now we're going to move on to the power of measuring and the power of data. What does that even mean? The power of measuring is about what gets measured, who measures it, and why do they measure it? And it is more important than you think. So I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by that. Academics may value precision and comparability at the expense of meaningful information. It doesn't mean that it's not meaningful to them, and it doesn't mean it's not meaningful to other people. It just means it might not be helpful to you. You might not need your data to be that precise and that comparable. What you really need is the causal mechanism. And that is important to know. It is important to know what you need from the data when you go looking for it. Another example is donor governments and global institutions often set the agenda based on what they can measure. And that leaves out the voices of those being measured. And it also means that you measure what you define, right? And it means you've defined the world and you've measured the world, and this is what's important. So just be careful that when donor governments and global institutions say this is the case because this is what we measured and this is what we should do, they've only measured what they could measure, not necessarily the universe of what should be measured. Okay? There is a limit to what you can measure. That's the case for everything. NGOs produce data that is meant to call public and governments to action, but it may not be replicable because it was way too difficult to collect. It was done in an investigatory manner. Their safety was at risk, but they managed to bring that information to light. It may not be done again, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. So there are always power relationships and institutional dynamics that structure the discussion around measurement. And if this is important because if you do not want to do harm, or you want to understand who loses out when you use data and when you create data, this is the kind of thing that you need to consider. So there's also the issue of data. What is the data that's produced? Who uses that data and how do they use it? And I'll give you 4 examples. Governments often game data in order to attract investment rather than implement meaningful reform. There was a case in the UK when they tried to reform the public sector and they put in targets and indicators that the government officials had to hit, and they tied it to their performance evaluation, which meant that the officials within government focused on those indicators at the exclusion of all else, and sometimes cut corners, sometimes moved resources to places that weren't in the public interest in order to get better scores on the indicators that were measuring their performance. This is an instructive example of how measurement and indicators don't always improve performance. Sometimes they skew performance in ways that you don't think that are not in the public interest. Another example is CSOs and local organizations with a history of being oppressed and ignored, they may completely mistrust data from their authoritarian governments. Even if the data is rigorous, even if it's statistically very robust, because they don't trust them. And trust is really important here. And the issue is that with this is that they also may not trust data that is being produced by institutions and organizations that collaborate with the governments that are oppressing them. And this includes places like the World Bank, who only works with governments. Those are their partners. So if data is produced by the World Bank and it's being funneled through the government, then it will be not trusted. Journalists and even busy managers may not have time or inclination to dig into methodologies for really complex data, even if it's questionable or otherwise, but the data itself is so interesting and so good for selling newspapers. They splash it all over the headlines because people are really interested in these sort of like big, disparate numbers. We're doing really well compared to this country, that sort of thing. It doesn't mean that they are doing it on purpose. It doesn't mean that they're lazy. It just means they don't have time to dig. And this is also a call for data producers to make their methodologies much more easier to understand, and much more accessible, because methodology matters for how data is used. It's become a lot more accessible over the last 10 years, which is great, which is why I am encouraging everyone who's here to dig into methodology papers to see what's happening, because they're not just written for technical audiences anymore. They're written for a general audience. And hopefully this session will help you understand what you need to look for in those methodology papers, because it is not enjoyable bedtime reading. I'm not going to promote it as such, but it may be that it holds the answers to using your data in a way that best suits your goals. And another example of the power of data is how donor governments use the data to determine funding recipients and amounts, even though the data producers themselves practically beg donor governments to not do this. They do it anyway. And it is not the best way to use the data sometimes, because it depends on how the data is been constructed, whether it actually should be used for that purpose, or if it skews prior funding priorities in directions we don't want. So context matters for more than just accurate measurement. Who is benefiting from that data? And this is about voice, inclusion, and justice. And who trusts that data? It's about objectivity, rigor, and bias. And if you want to know more about these issues, a good starting point, I've put the reference at the bottom. Sally Engelmary has written a lot on this, The Quiet Power of Indicators. This is just one of them. It matters for corruption. That's why I put it at the bottom. It's a different discussion than I can go into here, but it's a very important discussion about measuring, especially with corruption, because corruption matters so integrally to quality of life and standard of living for people in these countries that we're measuring. So a quick recap, action points for everyone watching. So what is being measured and what is being collected and analyzed? How do you answer them? You go to the methodology paper and you read through it. Find the information on methodology and find your answers to questions that I have posed today, and it will help you determine whether you should use that data and whether it will help you. If you can't find the methodology paper, send a message to the data producers and tell them they need to put that online. Number 3, what are the challenges that impact the usefulness of the data? Well, you must consider those boxes that I put up on the screen: validity, reliability, generalizability, and sustainability. Really important. And also time series, I should have put that up there. So you consider those things when you look at how the data has been constructed. And then how is data used and abused? Well, you must look at who benefits from, if this is important to you and it's become more important, you must look at who benefits from the data use, and you must look at who is excluded from the measurement process and the data interpretation. This is not a call to include everybody who's measured in the decisions around the measurement process. It is a call to start thinking about what are the best ways to include people in measurement process and interpreting the data, because sometimes decision by committee makes things longer, makes things more difficult, more challenging. You end up often with a better answer, an answer that's in everybody's best interest as opposed to one group. It's just a call to start thinking about that and what's the best way to do that. So Number 5, how do I apply all this to my context, problem, or goal? Possibly the reason that you are all here. So basically, you start with what are your measurement goals? What are your goals for using this data? And I have grouped them into 4 categories here. This is just one grouping. You might have things that don't fit in here, but this is sort of like the biggest chunk of why people use data and why people measure. There's advocacy goals, there's goals to produce actionable data, there's the goal to capture evidence of impact, and then there's this 4th area that I call knowledge production, but it actually is about scientific discovery, and it is about pushing the frontier of the field, and sort of maybe you're not applying it to everything, but you are coming up with really good data, really good information about what's happening on the ground. So we'll start with advocacy. So advocacy is about aiming for public recognition, calls for action. It often captures evidence of the status quo. It's often macro level, country level, or sectoral, and it's great for advocacy. Indices are great for advocacy in this way. Big, splashy headlines that get everybody talking, because that's what you want to do with advocacy. And a good example of this is the Corruption Perceptions Index. These comments are from Frank Vogel, who is the co-founder of Transparency International and worked on the first iterations of the CPI. So the initial aims of that index were to stimulate conversations about corruption at official levels, number 1, and 2, to generate global publicity. And they succeeded incredibly. It's a remarkable achievement that the CPI has done. Governments were so angry with the results, and still are so angry with the results every time they come out, that the protests lead to heated conversations, more analysis, and in the beginning, the World Bank was spurred to do its own index. And I can tell you that it still happens every day, every year, when the CPI is released, everybody braces, because the CPI data generate incredibly heated discussions, and everybody needs to talk. Everybody working in that space usually has to talk about it with the governments when they come out. That's great. It keeps it on the agenda, keeps it high on the agenda. There was also public awareness of corruption that was raised markedly. Everybody now knows what the CPI, well, not everybody, but people who work in the development space all know what the CPI is and all understand corruption. And that's because the information was great for media and global media and local media just to put in their newspapers, put on their websites. It just got everybody talking. So this was an example of how the data doesn't capture change. The data doesn't give you actionable data. It doesn't give you like these areas where you need to reform, but it does generate so much conversation that it leads to other things. So it's a good example of an advocacy goal for corruption measurement data. A second area second goal that you could have with using data or creating data is actionability. This is geared towards reform action. It's specific indicators, they're policy relevant, they're often at the micro and the meso level, the institutional, organizational level, and they include like a big range of indicators on risk, action resources, audits, investigations, and gap analysis, that kind of thing. What you're doing with these indicators is they relate very directly to what should be done to improve the score on the indicator, and not just to improve the score, but the idea is to improve the performance and the effectiveness of the institutions being measured. That's the idea. So its actionability is possible in several different ways. So the indicator itself identifies the problem or the good practice, and the resulting data identifies a potential reform path. So this is really important for risk indicators, because basically the risk indicator is telling you where your risks for corruption are within your process. And the idea is you go in and you fix those risks and the indicator will rise. The priority is not to improve the indicator score, like in a perfect world. The priority is to improve the process that's being measured, so that the indicator score rises. So, and this also works for disaggregated indicators. You have a big index, and hopefully if it's an index that wants to be both an advocacy tool and an actionability tool, all of the indicators will be released, all of them disaggregated, and all of them will relate to some really important process or procedure or mechanism within the scope of what they're measuring, so that it's clear when you have a low score on a particular indicator, what you should do to improve that indicator. A second way you can have actionability is the resulting data reveals corruption. That would be best case scenario. And then government agencies can then pursue a case. And that works with investigations and investigative journalism, with scandals, and then analysis of recorded data. Beneficial ownership data, for example, is proving really helpful for identifying areas of risk and possible areas of malfeasance. There are other types of databases that collect information on convictions, collect information on fines and penalties, and you can sort of pick out the patterns if you analyze it. And that's a good way you can make it actionable. Third way you can be actionable is the resulting data reveals an inefficiency or an ineffectiveness, and the reform path is suggested. And this works with audits, policy reviews, expenditure tracking, gap analysis, and action research. So these 5 types of measurements and the indicators that come out of them or are used to generate them are really helpful for working on institutional failure, inefficiency, and processes and programs that aren't working. Actionability has become a hot topic, or at least was a hot topic in the last 5 or 10 years, because the pushback against indices was, well, how do I use this? How does this even help me besides like starting conversations? Actionability was the response. And you could have under an index, you could have 50 indicators, 100, 150 indicators, all being aggregated up to produce your one country score. But those disaggregated indicators underneath are actually what's going to give you the actionable data. And if it's an index that purports to be actionable and says that it can be used, you need to look at those underlying indicators, and they should explain those indicators to you in all of their documents. It should be easy to find. I'm not asking you to spend 6 hours trying to find indicators and methodology. It should be easy to find if it's a worthwhile source. So the third area of the third goal that you might have in creating or using data is to provide evidence of impact. And this is about trying to capture progress over time. This is a really big and important topic within corruption measurement. And it is a topic that a lot of academics are working on, but it also intersects with donor reporting, policy evaluation, and monitoring and evaluation, because everybody who gets funding from a donor government or any kind of donor actually has to report back to say, this is how we use the data, but not only that, but this is what we did and what we achieved. So this sort of overlaps with corruption measurement initiatives. It's difficult to determine causation, as we all know. We're aiming for evidence of change and contribution unless you are doing a very clear impact evaluation. And that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is corruption measurement, anti-corruption measurement, risk indicators that capture information, and maybe they can also be used to capture progress or evidence of impact. So this is the issue with trying to capture impact with corruption measurement initiatives. There are several variables involved, and I think this matters most to people who see a corruption measurement initiative and this great corruption data super interesting, and they want to use it to capture evidence or sort of show that what they did in their work has been captured in this data point. It means that you don't have to do a lot of work to capture your own impact. Somebody else is capturing it for you. 5 variables that you should be aware of before you try this. Can you determine the causal mechanism that is driving the score? Do you know why these indicators have the scores that they do? And can you link your indicators or the indicators within that measurement initiative that are directly related to the causal mechanism? If you do not know why a score is being the score that has happened that way, if you don't know what is causing it, then you don't know how to change the score. That's really important. And do you have the means to address that causal mechanism? Do you have the funding? Do you have the technical expertise? Do you have all the people that are needed in order to tackle the issue that is driving that score? Number 4, do you have access to that causal mechanism? Is the government or is whoever is like in being measured going to give you access to be able to do that work? Oftentimes they don't want to work on issues of corruption, and they don't want anybody coming near the edges of that. So just consider that. And then do you have the time to achieve change between the baseline score and the next iteration of the data? Change takes time. And unless it's a really easy change, like the procurement data is not being released, we can now release the procurement data, that sort of thing. And it's not a hot topic like defense purchases or security purchases. It's just like health data or education data, for example, may not be as controversial as other types of data. Then maybe it's an easy thing to switch. And in fact, the only time I've ever seen in my 20 years of work a reform sort of or intervention in an area be reflected in global indicators as on open data, where the open data indicators were very clear, very policy relevant, very actionable. Somebody got a funding to work on open data, and as it happens, what they worked on were directly related to the indicators. And 2 years later, when they pulled up the open data scores, their country score had jumped by 10 or 12 points, which is a big deal. And they were overjoyed to find this to be the case. And I was overjoyed to find this to be the case because you rarely see this unless you're tackling the indicators in particular. So it is actually quite hard to use like externally generated data about corruption and anti-corruption as evidence of your own impact. Just be aware. And then the fourth area is knowledge production or scientific discovery. You're pushing the frontier. You're capturing evidence of the status quo that is difficult to observe. This corruption is often unobservable, and you have to sort of get down to the dig to see what's actually happening. And then also this area, this goal is about capturing change. It may be sophisticated, it may be difficult to replicate, but it is really important. It's not just for academics. So number one, it helps to establish new areas of discussion that are relevant for policy development. And this is where the GI ACE program that Paul and Liz are working on. Paul, we heard from last week. Liz, we'll hear from next week. They're doing great work in pushing the discussion forward and exploring all these different areas. Some are using indicators, some are not, some are measuring, some are not, but they're all producing information that is really helpful for better understanding corruption. This kind of work determines whether there has been change. This is really important because indices don't often capture change, and the kinds of initiatives that can capture change are often not sustainable because they're too resource intensive and they can't be done again. One example that I know of is the Index of Public Integrity that Paul talked about last week. They actually know and recognize that their index is probably not going to capture change. So what they've done is gone to their underlying indicators and created a mechanism for capturing change within those disaggregated indicators so that they can see if movement's being made on the lower level indicators. And we'll see, right, over the next 5 years, whether we're going to see a change in those underlying indicators. It's really important for people to do this, but it may not be applicable right now to what you're doing. These type of scientific discovery or knowledge production, it establishes the causal mechanism for change, which is what large-scale measurement initiatives rarely do because they just don't have the time to do it. They don't have the time to dig to find out why that score is happening the way it is for every single indicator that they're producing data for. And when you focus on the smaller parts, you can sort of understand what the causal mechanism is. And that's a very important thing to understand if you want to know why the indicator score is the way that it is. And lastly, this goal of knowledge production spurs the development of new measurement initiatives that better capture corruption, integrity, or risk by providing conceptual clarity. And Paul talked about this last week. It's so important to understand what you're measuring. And if you're trying to do something new, to be very, very clear about where you're doing and what your results are. Super important. So these are the 4 sort of general goals. So my concluding thoughts for you all are these 3. Methodology papers are not just for research experts. Everyone should be well acquainted with the data they are using. Go look at that methodology paper. It's usually not more than 20 pages. Sometimes it's even 10, okay? And if you go in with the things that I have talked about today and you're trying to get answers to those questions, you should be able to do it pretty quickly. Measurement initiatives can have more than one goal, but it's important to recognize what you want to achieve, and how you plan to do that. So you can have advocacy and actionability as your goal, but you need to understand that it's sort of a big enterprise to do that. You can try to capture impact and progress and try to do advocacy, but you need to plan it out ahead of time so that you know what you're doing and what you're getting into. And lastly, trade-offs are necessary, but you should be aware of what's being lost versus what's being gained in any measurement scenario. And this is not just about data types and units of measurement or units of analysis. This is also about who benefits and who gains from these trade-offs. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thanks to the site for providing this for us. And I'll give it over to Johannes for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Steph. Fantastic presentation. Really appreciate that. So many rich insights and well conjugated, really easy to follow, and at the same time presenting so many of the pillars that really underpin how we think about measurement and try to get better at it. So thank you so much for that. In the meantime, we've had a number of comments and thoughts trickle into the chat. Those will touch on different areas. And I'm inclined to just give people the word very briefly to explain the key question that they want to ask. We'll really do that in a brief moment. So maybe we can start with this question about the judiciary and whether there are examples. David, do you want to come in?
Hello, thank you. Yes, thank you, Stephanie, for your talk. It was very interesting and very insightful. While you were talking about these ways of measuring corruption using administrative data, I had this question about what are your thoughts about using data from the judiciary institutions, or, for example, from controllers' offices. I've been trying to do this in my country, in Colombia, but I know that this has a lot of limitations because you're never sure what are you measuring using this kind of data. So can you share your thoughts about this? And do you have any example of a paper or a study where they have used this kind of data to measure corruption? Thank you.
Good question. You're looking at administrative data. It's great that somebody's brought this up. So this is, I don't have any, first I'll start with, I don't have any examples in mind of papers, but I know they're out there because I've read them. So I just can't bring them to mind. But people have been trying to do this for a while. As you know, the issue with working on data that is generated in law enforcement in sort of the judicial area, and even with comptrollers who are identifying areas of inefficiency and irregularity, are you capturing the universe of what's happening, or are you capturing how proficient you are at capturing it? And they're two different things, right? One, you're measuring what's happening on the ground, and the other, you're measuring how good the institution is performing. So you have to be really clear about, number one, as you said, what you're measuring, but you also have to be very aware of how what you're measuring relates to what you think you're capturing. And I think the causal mechanism is a really important part of your interpretation of your data. And if you can identify a causal mechanism and try to test out your causal mechanism with your data, it'll go a long way to sort of validating whether you're capturing what you think you're capturing. I hope that made sense. So if you are looking at what the comptroller is doing and their data on irregularities and how many irregularities, what kind of irregularities, you need to be really very thoughtful about why they are collecting that data and whether it correlates with other types of data out there about the sector or the institution that you're looking at. So triangulation of data is going to be really important here. You need to confirm that what you're seeing in the comptroller's data actually resonates and correlates with what the other types of data for that sector, maybe citizen surveys, maybe experiences, maybe even other types of administrative data for that sector. And you can put together a picture of what's happening and try to come up with a causal mechanism for that. I think that's the best you can do for right now until somebody comes up with a very innovative way to deal with this. Maybe you, a very innovative way of how to work with administrative data like that in the judiciary.
Thank you.
And that ties in nicely with the next question by Raimundas about cross-verifying the accuracy of data. Raimundas, do you want to come in? You're on mute.
I think you're on mute. If you could unmute yourself.
Sorry, now I'm sorry. Thank you again for your nice presentations, but I have two questions because it's from my practical experience when I'm working with government institutions, especially when we catch this data or would like to measure the tendency of the corruptions, especially it's affected the image of the country in the global market. And I have two questions. First of all, what steps can be taken to cross-verify the accuracy of data from the multiple independent sources before using it in the research or in the reports? Because usually how to avoid the risk in this process, particularly political risk when sometimes the government presented much more, how to say, would like to portray the situation as better than in actually is that situations. And it's very sensitive questions. How to do that? How to verify that data?
Yes, that's a good question. And that goes back to reliability, I think. The question of is the data going to be consistent when you ask different people the same question? And in your case, you have an external source that's saying one thing and you have an internal source that's saying something different. And how do you reconcile that? I think that's the basis of your question. I think what you need to do is, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but go to the methodology paper and find out how they are verifying their own data. And if they are not doing enough work, in your opinion, to ensure that the data is representative, is actually capturing what they say it's going to capture, then you can argue that they're not getting the full picture and they should do something different, or they should improve their the survey of respondents, their expert assessors who are providing this data. They should do a better job of explaining how these assessors are actually capturing what's actually happening. I know that there are a lot of disagreements with these global indices and these bigger data sets and how they portray countries that are less resourced or maybe are perceived as having a higher corruption, especially with the CPI. And how do you disprove because you think it's wrong? I think you have to go to the methodology and point out the weaknesses in the methodology. And if you can produce your own data, it's not as easy as you think to produce your own data, but you can start thinking about ways that they can improve their data and offer it to them. Or you can think about things that people need to think about in your own country if they want to construct a data source. It really comes down to the methodology, and it comes down to that reliability of like, how are they checking their own data and whether you think it's representative of the problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. Actually, I'm doing that when I would like to hear from your opinion. And second question, what is the future? What I see in the future, the progress to avoid that risk is second question from my side about artificial intelligence. What is your opinion? Is it artificial intelligence can be used to detect that inconsistencies in this large ecosystem of the data?
Yeah, I'm sure it could be applied to the ecosystem of data. I don't know how it would be. That would be a good question for Liz next week, the future of corruption measurement. She might have had more experience with it than I have, but I'm sure it could be applied. Whether it would be a good result, I don't know, but I bet it could be applied. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We do have a few questions on social network analysis and also artificial intelligence. But let me jump those questions and put them toward the end of our conversation and go into a particular aspect that you mentioned, Steph, a couple of times throughout your presentations, and that's MEL and the ways in which we might use data, do it better, use data more, yeah, in smarter ways to make MEL work for us in different ways. So Rola, if you want to come in and ask your question, that'd be great.
Sure, thank you. So I am interested to hear your thoughts about how can we perhaps improve the way we track progress on our own side projects. So not really necessarily looking at those global indices, but in terms of developing useful performance indicators that are meaningful also at the aggregate for SIPE's own work, which a lot of it is focused on incentivizing private sector actors to become compliant, to apply integrity practices, and eventually, or at the same time, themselves pushing for anti-corruption reform. So if there are any resources that can help us in developing our own indicators, many indicators for SIPE. Thank you.
So I see this as two issues. One is, are you developing indicators that are capturing what you want to capture? And two, do you understand the impact of those indicators? Meaning, are the indicators driving change in the way that you want them to change, you want them to? So you may not even have thought about how the indicators are affecting behavior or performance, but it is a really important way of verifying whether your indicators are well designed and whether they are helpful. So I think your question is about how can we have better indicators? And there are a lot of people out there who are working on MEL and behavioral change. And I can put together a list and give it to Johannes, and he can circulate it. I don't have names of papers or people right now off the top of my head, but I know people have been working on this. But I do encourage you to just as in the case of the UK and their new public management initiative, just because, I mean, they have indicators and they wanted them to influence behavior change, and it was the wrong type of behavior change that they got in many cases. So when you're thinking about indicators about compliance, you should really think about how this is maybe going to affect the way that they view their own job and the way that compliance fits in, and whether compliance is considered a burden, whether we need to skirt things so that we can make it look like we're complying, that sort of stuff. And that's sort of a separate initiative. But it is really important to verify whether your indicators are well designed and whether they are having a good or bad impact.
Thank you. Yeah, no, for us, it's more like indicators for ourselves to know if we are, like what you mentioned earlier about evidence of impact of our own interventions, not so much as the indicators being used to incentivize the actors that we work with, more than for us to know if we are being, if our work is effective, basically effectiveness.
It's a good question. There's no easy answer. I think in my opinion, everybody who works with corruption measurement or tries to measure it should have somebody on their team who is well versed in corruption measurement and measurement issues, because it's quite hard to build your knowledge base at the same time that you're trying to do your own work and like non-measurement related work. And this can be done either by, I think there's two ways of helping you through this. One is you choose a junior member of your team and you task them with understanding corruption measurement or understanding measurement and measurement of progress. And they take, because they don't have huge responsibilities that like a top manager would have, you can build into their work program. They need to understand measurement. And that helps. They can build it in their career, and then they become the person who understands measurement within your team, and that's great. If you need it done quickly, you look outside and you bring in an advisor who can help you to refine your indicators and tell you ideally why these indicators need to be changed and how they need to be changed, so that you don't always need to go back and help with those indicators. You can keep refining your own indicators, but there's no easy quick fix there's no quick easy answer for you. Those are my two sort of suggestions if you want to get better at creating indicators.
Thank you. That's
Yes, thank you indeed. And I want to amend this point with just two quick thoughts. One is I fully agree the MEL discussion in anti-corruption programming is so important for the reasons you presented, Steph and Rola, you picked up on. And it is something that all of us struggle. So irrespective whether you talk to government X or government Y, a particular regulatory body, NGOs or the private sector, they all say the same thing. We got to get better at understanding how our programs are actually affecting the change that we want to see. Now, I think in many ways, the way that we've grown up to learn about this change is oftentimes to think X leads to Y, this linear thinking of, I provided input, here's the outcome. Hopefully, can I measure my impact down the line? But there's this one example, which I've referenced a couple of times, which I continue to find really, trailblazing, which is that TAI report, the Transparency and Accountability Initiative, did an evaluation about the ecosystem in which their beneficial ownership transparency efforts worked out between governments, civil society, and the private sector, and also multi-stakeholder coalitions. And in that report, they did an evaluation in which just put together the different puzzle pieces to then tell a story over the course of 5 to 7 to 10 years. How has our space changed? How have we taken this concept, beneficial ownership transparency, a hugely important anti-corruption issue, and learned from that and moved it forward? And I think that's one of those pieces where we, as the MEL community, perhaps, can just be also at times pushing back to the donors and saying, look, we won't be able to prove that there is impact 2 years down the line. But what we can say is that we've strengthened the ecosystem. We've done a fantastic job across funders, foundations, civil society, the private sector, and champions and government to really create that ecosystem. And here's what we've measured. Here's what we've observed. And I think that's one of those pieces where also for organizations such as SIPE, ourselves, but also others in that same size and with that outlook on funding and timelines, where that would be a helpful thing going forward. And talking about BOT, let me just briefly hand it over to Alana, who is again with us. Alana, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I did. Thank you. And appreciate you flagging that, it's still kind of a long journey to comprehensively measuring the impact of beneficial ownership transparency reforms, but it is one that I think there's increasing attention to the fact that we need to be on. So I was wondering if you have any kind of analogous areas that you could point us to where we could look to help get inspiration for methodologies to take this forward and what the kind of initial steps are that we should be taking to get towards that point to being able to measure impact. Thank you.
Good question. So here's my approach to measuring change and dealing with sort of proving that you're having an impact or sort of trying to capture the causal mechanism. It depends on the context, and no one's going to like that answer. So there's no real methodology that I can point you to. There's no real foundational paper that I can point you to. I think what it entails, what you're asking for, what would my solution would be, sit with somebody who understands or has worked in the space of measuring change. And this could be an MEL person, this could be a corruption measurement person, just somebody who is willing to work through the things that you think are important to capture, and then can come up with ideas for how to do that in a way that's meaningful. And what's key, I think, is your findings, you want them to be meaningful, correct? You want them to be actionable. And I think that means you're going to have to get creative in the way that the TAI was creative. They didn't have indicators per se. They came up with ways to measure and document their work and their the change that happened because of their work. They didn't fit in any of the boxes. And I think the boxes, I used a lot of boxes in my presentation. I don't think boxes are really super helpful when you're trying to come up with ways to measure change, because it all depends on the context. It depends on the work that you're doing, and it depends on what you want to achieve. So I would say it requires a degree of creativity that you're not going to find in sort of directions or that kind of document. That would be an easy answer. It is going to take some work. That's not a great answer. I know you don't like that. That's not like the answer everybody wants, but I think that it will produce more meaningful results than you might think.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's move over to this question about artificial intelligence, which was again by Raimundas, and he said, how can AI be leveraged to detect anomalies and inconsistencies in large data sets? I guess to broaden that question a little bit, what's your thinking about using AI in this process of measurement?
I think AI would be great for identifying risk areas. And I think it's even being used or experimented with on risks, for example, in procurement, and risks in other areas. But you have to be really careful with AI because it doesn't always consider the reasons. It doesn't capture causal mechanisms. Just like any measurement scenario, it doesn't capture causal mechanisms unless you're asking it to capture causal mechanisms. And even then, I think you need human beings on the case because it requires a sort of networked thinking that I don't know that AI has. So I think it can be used, and it can be used in particular cases right now. Whether it can be used for capturing integrity, I don't know, because what it can capture may not be what you want to capture, and it may not be what will impact integrity in a good way, for example.
Great, thank you. As we were talking about AI, are there any other thoughts about technology that might just swirl around the audience and you wanted to ask something or share your thoughts about technology before we move on to the next set of issues that came up in the chat? I don't see any hand popping up, which is okay. I think largely agreed, right, on this just managing the risk while also making sure that the opportunities that technology gives us, including this space, that we make use of that. Oh, Zacher. All right, come on in, please.
Yeah, I'm generally I come mainly from a qualitative research background, so whenever you're talking about technology platforms, my first question is, well, my fear with a lot of these platforms is that there's what do you call it? There's a false sense of security that develops. I have no idea what the nuts and bolts of this thing are. I have no idea how this thing works, and yet it's giving me output that I can't be 100% sure about. And that's one of the things I'm always worried about whenever I'm dealing with any technology platform. Even though I graduated from a technology management program, it's just one of those things that that's always at the back of my head: is how reliable is this thing, and how does it work?
I mean, it's a good point. This is why I'm always telling, it's a good point for measurement in general, because this is why I keep saying, go to the methodology paper, find out what they did, find out how they did it, so you can decide whether you like this data. And AI often doesn't provide us with the methodology paper or the methodology behind what it does, or it's so complex that you can't understand it. It's a good point about the dangers of technology. I think if AI is going to be used in corruption, there need to be calls for how it's being used and how it's being designed and programmed, so you can decide if you like what it's pulling up or what it's producing.
Just to put a stop to, or to not to put a stop, but just to put a coda on that particular piece on technology. We've been discussing internally perhaps a two-part series of how to think through AI for anti-corruption, and maybe we should also take up the question of AI in anti-corruption measurement. So come February or March next year, maybe we have an opportunity to put that a little more on under scrutiny, that particular topic. Yes, so I think the penultimate series of topics that came up here in the chat is about social networks and network analysis and the way that this might be useful or how it could be measured in anti-corruption work. So Gary or Gianni Trica, do you want to come in with your question, with your thoughts?
I can go ahead first, and then Gary maybe. My question is actually, I mean, on social network analysis, but I think I want to acknowledge that social network analysis is very data heavy to look at the relationships, power dynamics and all of the information flows and stuff. But I can also see some of the metrics that are being used having the potential to be developed, for example, into like an institutional vulnerability index or something, building on the methodology and the data that is like produced following that methodology. So my question is whether there is an example of using SNA methodology to measure corruption that has the potential to be developed into an index. And I think Gary has a similar question. So to answer Gary's question, in my understanding, social network analysis is one way, and there's link analysis and stuff also to measure or capture networks at local level. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm Gary from Indonesia, but right now I'm studying in Australia, and my research related to how networks influence budget allocation and project implementation in Indonesia. So my question is, how do this, you mentioned about formal and informal actors within the network, so how they influence principal-agent relationships when it comes to managing resource and accountability mechanism, and also when we considering the cultural context, because there's difference between global south and global north. And then also I want to follow up about the social network analysis, how we capture the networks when we interview powerless actors within the network, and how to make them reveal the top man within the networks. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
I'm so glad this came up because I'm super interested in how network analysis can be used for corruption measurement. I can't even talk. I'm so excited. So GIACE has done a lot, well, not a lot, I think several really key studies. This is Paul Haywood's and Liz David Barrett's program. They've done a lot of studies on, or they've had studies on using network analysis and corruption. And I think they're fascinating. What I haven't seen is how very easily it can be adapted to large-scale initiatives. It might work in a case or an area or like a limited scope, but I don't know how you could reliably compare networks against each other, which is, I think, one of the things that people would want to do. But I do think networks are great for this network analysis are great for understanding the problem areas and the risks. But you have to be, number one, able to define what it is that you're seeing. You might see something really weird, but you have to be able to explain what is happening. And number two, causal mechanisms are also really, really important in network analysis to be able to do anything about it. So you know that it's happening, but do you know why it's happening? Do you know how it's happening? That I think is going to be the key to making network analysis the next new sort of corruption measurement. So understanding that causal mechanism and making the data not just meaningful from we understand what's happening in this case, but jumping to generalizability where this case can help us with other cases, and here's why. And two, we know what is happening, and we also know why and how, so it can help us with fixing the problems that we're finding. So I think you need to be able to answer those questions in order to make it sort of more large scale or more applicable to a variety of situations.
Thank you. And I think your answer also speaks and corroborates this finding that you've highlighted, but also Paul in his first presentation, that there needs to be a conversation between measurement and aims of measurement and the theoretical underpinnings of how we think about corruption, the causal mechanisms that we try to work out, oftentimes in parallel or independent of measurement, but oftentimes hopefully also in connection with measurement. This last question and your answer leads nicely to a last question by Kinga. You want to come in and ask your question? Kinga?
Hello. Do you hear me? Maybe you don't see me. I don't know what happened with my
We can
camera,
hear you.
but
We can hear you.
yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for the fascinating presentation, Stephanie. It was very well built and clear. And my question is according to the validation process, because I'm from the Hungarian Integrity Authority, and we are planning to make and develop a new measurement tool for especially the Hungarian sample. And we see that most of the former measurement tools worldwide start the validation process to compare their findings and data to, for example, CPI and different kind of composite indicators. And we don't want to run that problem if our future findings not run in parallel moving with the CPI findings that look at as rubbish, because maybe it's not the valid process. So I would like to know and ask you that, is there any other kind of opportunity to validate our findings and our data if we don't want to compare it to CPI or COC or any other kind of findings formally?
There are tons and tons of data points out there. I think it depends on what it is that you're looking for. Can you tell me again what department you're looking at, or what you're sort of measuring?
Yeah, basically we would like to develop a measurement tool with a proxy indicator lag and with a big sample survey lag. So there are two different ways how we would like to collect data from the field.
And what are you actually measuring? What is it? Integrity?
We would like to measure integrity and the perception of corruption and the experience of corruption from the society and from special small subgroups like businessmen and civil servants. So they're going to be our special subgroups.
Okay, and you want to validate them. Well, I mean, there are lots of instances of validating it or sort of using the CPI as does it correlate with CPI findings. We talked about opinions and how they don't change very much. The CPI doesn't really change that much these results from year to year, unless there's a giant turmoil in the country, and then they might drop. But I think it's the biggest one, and it's the most known one, and it's really quite rigorous. So if you want to correlate opinions with that might be the way to go. But in terms of experiences, I don't think you need to validate them. I think you need to, with external sources, I think you need to be really clear in your methodology how you're going to collect that data, how you verify that data, how it's representative, and if it's not representative, why it's not representative, that sort of thing. So you're going to argue that your data, or justify that your data is useful through your really rigorous methodology. And you don't have to go elsewhere to sort of see if it correlates with other things.
So basically it's not a must.
It's not a must. I don't think for experience data it's a must. For opinion data, it might be helpful because everybody likes to correlate with the CPI. But I think for experience data or expert assessment data, if you're looking for you're looking to measure integrity within your country, I don't know that you need to correlate it with other things outside, from things that measure it from the outside, for example.
Okay, and if we would like to observe not just perception data, but for example, proxy indicators from the public procurement system, is it a must there to compare and to
I don't think so. I think procurement systems are so particular to the country in which you are operating, because there are so many different laws and policies that impact what you can do with your procurement, how you can release information, what type of information you can release. And the legal frameworks even vary so much that you don't even really see comparative data sets on public procurement. So I think you work on making sure that your proxy indicators are really well designed, and you pilot them. And then you look at your data from the pilots, and then you refine, and then you can launch. That's the best way to do it. And make sure you're working with someone who understands procurement, like Mihaly Fazakis, and even Liz David Barrett, who's coming up there. They've piloted and sort of innovated in this area, and their work would be probably very helpful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Very practical, right? Because that's precisely what happens all the time. These are the questions that pop up when we try to work on things on a practical level. Thank you also for that answer. There is a last question that I missed earlier, which I'll read that out for a minute. When conducting firm and organizational level case studies, what are some of the things to think about when designing your case study research to squeeze the most out of it? So it's about case studies, which is nice to end this conversation on that end. I just want to say that this is precisely one of the issues that we'll, I think, discuss next week with Liz just as well. But over to you, Steph.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you want to squeeze out of your case studies. Do you want to make it generalizable? And if you do want to make it applicable to different contexts, you need to think about how it might relate to other contexts while you're interpreting the data, and then you can sort of discuss how it relates to other contexts when you're interpreting your data. If you want to design your measurements so that you get big bang for your buck, I think you need to link it up with the big hot topics in the field, and make sure that if you want to make a statement on what people are really concerned about, that you design your measurements so that you are actually collecting data that will help you make a statement and you can interpret that data. But if you want to make it so that your case study can be replicated, then there's a different set of questions to make sure that other people can do it, and it's not just particular to your case, for example. So there's a lot of different issues that you can consider when you're designing your case studies for how you want both the case study methodology and the data to be used. But doing that upfront is helpful.
Thank you so much. And I think just to make that link even more explicit to next week's last installment of this 101 series, I think Liz has some thoughts about what it might mean at firm level and the types of measurements that we should try to focus on over the next few years, perhaps. So thank you so much to Stephanie for your presentation and for the answers that you provided. Thank you so much to the audience for being with us, for all your good questions, for the conversation. I hope to see you again next week on Thursday, and I wish you a good rest of your day. Bye for now.